Okay, so it's my pleasure to welcome all of you today for the next lecture in our online series of lectures, The Elusive Shape of the Platonic Tradition. And today our guest is Professor David C. Schindler from the Pontifical Institute, John Paul II Institute at the Catholic University of America. And Professor Schindler has published several important books in the previous years, but maybe it's just my favorite ones or the ones that I think need to be emphasized. So obviously his book on Plato, which will be related, I can imagine, in some ways to today's topic, namely the 2008 book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, the book dedicated to the study of Plato's Republic, but also other two of his books, which I really think are worth reading, is Freedom from Reality, the Diabolical Character of Modern Liberty. If I'm saying the title correctly, it's 2017. And 2021, the book, The Politics of the Real, which is a study in political philosophy. And I think personally, it's a good way to survive the coming elections in America. Maybe to slowly read that book because it's a very well written and a very philosophically serious and deep inquiry into the nature of politics. But today we will hear a lecture which will be focused on Plato and some epistemological issues. The title of the lecture is Phaedrus and the Madness of Reason, Arriving at the Place of Truth. So without much further ado, Professor Schindler, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Metrius, for the invitation, and thank you all for coming out, I guess, this evening for most of you. Anyone over here, I guess, this afternoon. But what I'm going to present, it's really half of a larger project that's in progress, an essay on the Phaedrus, and I'll be just presenting really the first half of a larger argument, but it's got a certain logic integrity to it, so I thought it would work. In his pivotal essay, Plato's Doctrine of Truth, Heidegger famously identifies this founding philosopher in the Western tradition as that thinker in whom the meaning of truth shifted from the more fundamentally ontological sense of disclosure or unhiddenness, aletheia, to the more epistemological sense of being correct, orthos. In this latter sense, in which truth comes to reside predominantly within the self-regulated limits of logic, and therefore thinking in forgetfulness of being comes to occupy itself principally with definitions, propositions, and their formal relations, has been the ruling tradition of Western metaphysics, according to Heidegger. As he says, the decisive moment for Heidegger and Plato's thinking occurs in the Republic's allegory of the cave. For it's in this text that we see, on the one hand, the residual presence, so to speak, of the older sense of truth, and the task of liberation from the hiddenness of beings in the cave. But also, on the other hand, a definitive yoking of truth to the idea, which is being in its most perfect manifestness as a definable what, or essence. So for Heidegger, henceforward, truth is measured by conformity to this standard, grasped essentially in thought. Now, there has been no shortage of critics who have been able compellingly to show that Heidegger misjudges Plato by misinterpreting one passage or another in the Republic. Our interest here in mentioning Heidegger is not to offer yet another evaluation of his reading of the cave, but to take our initial bearings from the line of reflection that Heidegger opens up. And does so in such a profound and interesting way. But to follow this line, so to speak, into a dialogue that does not get as much attention in determining Plato's understanding of truth, in spite of the fact that it's arguably central to his thought on this subject, and that dialogue is the Phaedrus. So our guiding focus in the present presentation will be not to evaluate Heidegger and his reading of Plato, but to understand Plato himself, to explore basic aspects of his notion of truth and its connection to reason as propounded in the Phaedrus, but with the concerns of Heidegger as a backdrop to help frame and illuminate the issue. We'll begin with some remarks on the setting of the dialogue in order to provide a context then for Plato's characterization of truth. And we will be attending in a particular way here to how the setting of the dialogue casts a particular light on the moment of recollection. So that's going to be at the culminating point of the lecture, because this is a decisive moment in Plato's description of the intellect's coming to truth. So I'm going to summarize the next point just for the sake of time here. In the opening section, I lay out how the theme of movement is crucial in the Phaedrus, which begins with the question, whither and whence, where are you going, where are you coming from? The last word of the lecture of the dialogue is let us go. And this theme of movement, of leading and being led and following, walking around, eventually walking outside the walls of the city, taking a stroll, eventually coming to rest. These are the basic themes of the dialogue that the setting makes clear. There are two things here that I'd like to highlight in particular. The first thing is that there's a basic transition that's really thematic inside the walls and outside. Inside the city, which is the place of business exchange, interchangeability, and then outside, which is a place of beauty and rest. So that's one thing that I want to highlight. And then the second point that I want to highlight is that this language of motion that characterizes the setting gets deepened when Plato presents an interpretation of the soul, essentially in terms of motion, self-motion. So this notion of motion is not just the setting of the dialogue, but it becomes thematic for our interpretation of what the soul is. Okay, so enough for that. Let us turn now to reflect more directly on the nature of truth as presented in the dialogue within the context of this theme. One of the best known, perhaps notorious, features of Plato's philosophy is his so-called theory of forms, his idea that the truth of things, the root of all of our thought and action, are transcendent essences beyond, in some sense, sensible experience and accessible to the mind alone. Now, this idea is more often than not presented in a caricatured sort of way. But I've made an argument in other places, and so have many others, that we don't need to think of this in such a facile and dualistic sense as it's so often presented. Now, what's distinctive about the Phaedrus in comparison to Plato's mention of the forms in other dialogues is that Plato presents the distinction between the sensible and the intelligible in such an extraordinarily dramatic way, as a kind of distance that needs to be overcome. Something similar can be seen in the allegory of the cave in the Republic, in which the prisoners accede to the truth on this score only after being forcibly released from the bonds of appearances and their concomitant sensual pleasures. Though the two dialogues, the Phaedrus and the Republic, are similar in this respect, there are nevertheless three interesting differences between them. First, in the Republic, the drama is played out specifically in the light of the good, whereas in the Phaedrus, it's beauty specifically that leads the way. Second, apparently because the ordering principle in the Phaedrus is beauty, pleasure and sense experience are not in the first place presented as obstacles to transcendence in the Phaedrus, as they seem to be in the Republic and in other dialogues. But even if this pleasure poses an ever-present danger, such experiences is presented here as originally a way into transcendence. Finally, if the Republic presents the transition from the sensible to the intelligible from an external perspective, the Phaedrus approaches the experience, so to speak, from the inside, describing, you might say, the prisoner's own experience of the journey from below into the realm of truth. Far from opposing the Phaedrus to the Republic, I'm suggesting we ought to see this presentation here as a sort of a synthesis connecting the Republic with the other dialogue that depicts the powerful attraction of beauty, namely the symposium. So I want to present the Phaedrus as kind of linking the symposium and the Republic. Now, the distinction between the realm of the sensible and the realm of the intelligible, let's call it the immanent or mundane sphere on the one hand, and the transcendent or supra-heavenly sphere on the other, is marked quite sharply in the dramatic structure of the dialogue itself. Although Phaedrus and Socrates have left the city to practice their speeches, they remain in a place of principally physical beauty. If physical beauty turns out to be an image of real beauty, as we're going to discover, this place outside the physical walls, hyper orion, could be interpreted as an image of the real transcendence outside the walls of the world simply, hyper urion. Socrates' first speech was offered in defense of the position adopted by Lysias, namely that one ought to give favors to the non-lover rather than the lover, which presumes that love represents a harm to good human life. When they finished their initial exchange of speeches, right at the physical peak of noon, Plato says, it appears to be the proper time to depart and return to the everyday life of the city. But their departure is interrupted by what Socrates calls his divine sign, which condemns his first speech and demands a recantation. Socrates consents, as his unfailing wont, to the divine admonition, giving first and unequivocally clear negative judgment. There is no truth in that story, he says, and then presenting an alternative positive account. To underscore the difference between Socrates' two speeches even further, speeches that are separated from each other by the intervention of the divine, the interruption from above, we might say, Plato has Socrates present his first speech somewhat comically with a sheet over his head, while he speaks the second unveiled, his eyes fully opened, so to speak. So what's at issue here is a radical shift in perspective. The very first thing Socrates does in the Palinode is open the horizon of the dialogue to the higher sphere by observing that the disturbance of human order can be caused not only by an intrusion from below, as it were, but also by the arrival of a principle from above, as a gift of the gods, he says. He begins his account proper immediately with a proof of the immortality of the soul, which is to say, by demonstrating its kinship with the transcendent. This may be seen as a kind of inverse complement to the presentation in the Phaedo. If the latter dialogue argues for the supersensible forms as a way of proving the immortality of the soul, the Phaedrus argues for the immortality of the soul as a way of showing forth the existence of the realm of supersensible truth. The point here, in other words, is to propose that human existence cannot properly be understood as circumscribed within the merely immanent sphere of sensible experience, but requires the perspective introduced by the higher realm of what transcends the sensible. This perspective casts a new light on Socrates' first speech, and this is important to note. It's not that what he says in that first speech, namely his argument that the clear-sighted, rational non-lover is to be preferred to the lover who is given over to bodily appetite. It's not that this speech is simply false in contrast to the truth that ought to have been seen from that perspective. Instead, Socrates first presents the truth as it appears from a limited perspective, that is, from the strictly immanent sphere. In other words, if the forms do not exist, if there are no gods, if there is no transcendence, if there's nothing beyond the material world, then it is true that one ought to follow one's rational judgment about what is one's best interest, rather than allowing oneself to be ruled by the disorder of sensible pleasures. While love is always ultimately directed at beauty, from the mundane perspective, the only beauty available is the beauty of bodies, ton somaton. In order to make the argument on the terms set by Lysias, Socrates artificially adopts this position of ignorance. He goes down, as it were, from above into the cave of appearance, symbolized by his covering his head. The falsity of this position cannot be determined from within that position of ignorance, and within the horizon set by the definition of love he offers. But it becomes apparent when he approaches the same problem from a radically different standpoint. So, as one scholar rightly observes, this new perspective is perfectly revolutionary, entailing a change that is simultaneously ontological, anthropological, and theological. It's a change in one's conception of reality, of the nature of the soul, and of the divine. Within this new perspective, the meaning of love is transformed. If it could not but appear as irrational, that is, as below and so against reason, interpreted as informed judgment concerning what is best for one, so rational opinion that strives for what is correct, or rational self-interest, we would say. If it cannot but appear this way from the immanent mundane perspective, love proves from the higher perspective to be supra-rational. So you see, I'm making a distinction between the irrational and the supra-rational. It does not supplant, as supra-rational, it does not supplant reason, but reorders it in relation to a principle that transcends it. While this difference between the irrational and the supra-rational may not, and indeed cannot, be seen on the surface, it means, as we'll explain further below, that love is able to contain reason even as it surpasses it, rather than being simply opposed to reason, which it cannot but attempt to coerce from below. And the very notion of reason, as we'll see, turns out to be radically different in the two cases. So we're beginning to see why the language of place, topos, is so important in this dialogue. It's possible for one to make correct judgments from the mundane perspective, but these, even as correct, are inadequate and potentially misleading when considered from the proper perspective. Contrary to Heidegger's best judgment on the matter, which we alluded to at the outset, for Plato, there's a profound difference between truth and correctness. Truth for Plato is not in the first place a characteristic of utterances or even our judgment of things. It's not even simply identical with the being of things, if that means the being of one thing or another, though that's a much more adequate characterization. Significantly, Plato never presents truth as a particular object of the mind, a form, in the way that he does beauty, for instance, or even, at least in some respects, as he does the good in the Republic. Instead, quote, here's that scholar mentioned earlier again, quote, as a generic designation of the contents of the hyperanius topos, so the supra-heavenly place, aletheia is a characteristic of all the beings in that region. Each of those beings is imbued with aletheia. So truth is best understood as belonging to a place, which Plato calls the supra-heavenly sphere, the field of truth, from within which things show themselves as they are. Perhaps it's best to say that truth is the being of things as manifest to the mind, but that such a manifestation requires a space in which things may be what they are, and in which mind is elevated to see them as such. So I want to suggest this space is something like Heidegger's clearing, Lichtung. It's the space where truth is possible. Okay. It's generally recognized that Plato draws a special correlation between the intellect and being, a correlation he identifies with knowledge, episteme. What's distinctive about the Phaedrus is that he presents the object of the intellect not just as being, to on, or even the really real, ontios on, as he often does elsewhere, but here as the ousia ousa ontos, being as object, activity, and mode. The threefold perfection in which being is, what it does, and how it does it. Plato presents being as beingly being, one might say. Plato presents this perfection as the subject of true knowledge, that which true knowledge is about, and says it corresponds to nous, mind or intelligence. To see the truth of things requires entering into a new place, being transported out of one's usual place, becoming out of place, as Socrates says at 230c, so that the very same things may now present themselves differently. It's significant that Plato uses the language of initiation to describe the man who's entered this place. Plato says he's always being initiated into the perfect mysteries. This is also why he describes it as an initiation and entry into a higher sphere, which is not a gradual process, but a decisive transition. In a certain sense, one can say that this new perspective is more correct than the previous, but the point is that correctness is measured by truth rather than the other way around. What is at issue here is not having a new idea or making a new judgment, but rather undergoing a radical change of place so that every idea and judgment is different, deeper, we might say, or more true, rather than simply more correct from within the same sphere, same frame of reference. Having identified the place of truth, Plato then turns to describe the way the human soul enters it. First, by presenting the vision of truth in its ideal form. The gods, he explains, are not composite organisms, body and soul, but are pure unity. Intriguingly, whereas one might think this would mean the gods gaze on truth continuously, Plato says instead that they also have to depart from their home in the heavens and rise up to the transcendent truth beyond. What distinguishes gods from men is that the gods are able to make this journey effortlessly and as a whole. Human souls, by contrast, are complex, which makes the journey much more dramatic. To describe this drama, Plato introduces here the famous allegory of the soul as a charioteer steering two horses, an unruly horse and a docile one. There's some dispute about what these three figures represent and how they correspond to the tripartite soul Plato describes in the Republic. But however one may parse the details, we can say in general terms that the two horses represent the two impulses Socrates describes in his first speech. So the passions, which strive after gratification without concern for order, and the reasoned judgment or acquired opinion, doxa is one of the words he uses, which strives after correctness in relation to one's interests. The charioteer, then, is the nous. So this is the thing that comes into place only with his new perspective. The nous, the dimension of human existence, Socrates introduces in the palinode. In other words, the chariot here represents the genuinely transcendent dimension of the soul, which is that which is capable of rising above appearance and the human concern associated with it, and thereby catching sight of truth. Significantly, Plato says that even in its inspired state, the human soul does not transcend the physical realm as a whole, as the gods do, but instead reaches the upper limit of the heavens so that the nous is able to catch a glimpse of what lies above. Significantly, too, because the charioteer is joined with the two horses, the intellect can accede to this vision only if the two other parts of the soul cooperate, so to speak. It's not so much the rational judgment that requires converting in this case, since judgment naturally follows the intellect, if such is present, or if it's not, it follows the passions. By any event, to unfold the allegory a bit, we ought to observe that the cooperation of the noble horse is essential in mediating the charioteer's guidance to the unruly horse. The need for this mediation becomes apparent if we attempt to envision the allegory as a charioteer piloting a single, unruly horse. At the same time, however, we see that the unruly horse cannot be controlled simply from the outside, but must itself be impelled from within. The passions must in some respect desire what the charioteer desires, and the noble horse desires along with him. What Plato describes here in powerful poetic terms, he also presents what might be thought of as the more prosaic terms of logical reasoning. But it's important that we not separate the image and the logic here. At 249 C and D, Plato says that the vision of truth is essential to humanity to such an extent that a soul cannot be human without having glimpsed truth. And he describes the vision of truth thus, quote, "A human being must understand that which is intelligently uttered in reference to a form, kat eidos, proceeding from many sensible perceptions and gathering these up into one through reason. This complex act bears a rarely noted but striking similarity to the complex activity of the soul that Plato had just described using the metaphor of the horses and charioteer. As well it should, since we're talking about the same thing in both cases, namely the way in which the embodied human soul grasps truth. So there is, first of all, a unity to the vision. The complex whole is seen all at once. But this unity has is complex, which means it's constituted by dimensions that remain irreducibly different. The verb used for understanding, xuniemi, literally means to bring together, to come together. The dimension of this bringing together into a unified whole that corresponds to the unruly horse, which represents the bodily passions, is of course the multiplicity of sense perception. This multiplicity is able to be gathered into a unity, eis hen, only because there is a single reference point to which the various sensibles can be related. In this case, the form, eidos, which can serve as such a unifying principle only if it can be seen and so aimed at. It's the charioteer, the intellect or nous, that actually sees the form as such. As we recall, the really real reality lies outside the cosmos and thus lacks any feature that would make it accessible to the senses. That's perfectly transcendent. It is, Plato says, visible only to the intelligence, which he identifies as what steers the soul here. The gathering itself occurs by reasoning, logismo, that is, by the discursive judgment that connects the grasp of the form on the one hand and the sensible perception on the other. This activity clearly resembles the noble horse insofar as that horse mediates in a certain respect between the other two parts of the soul. So it's docile to the direction received from the charioteer, and yet it is a horse like its more passionate partner. One of the ways this allegory illuminates the more technical description of the vision of truth, in addition to bringing out the drama in this act that might otherwise remain hidden, is that it shows forth the integrated wholeness of the event. And the grasping of truth, it is not that one first has sense experience, distended without order, that one then reasons about this data received through the senses, and that one is finally able, by virtue of this reasoning, to reach a conclusion in the form, the universal concept. This account of knowledge, which we would describe as empiricist, has it exactly backwards. It is only by virtue of a glimpse of the form that we can, through reason, gather up the sensibles. Indeed, that we can recognize that they are so gatherable. But we see from the allegory that the human soul can lift its head, so to speak, up above the firmament of the heavens only through the transport of the horses. It is only by the motion of the lower parts of the soul that it can reach the vision of the forms in the field of truth. So we see there's an essential reciprocity between intellect and sense perception, which is captured beautifully millennia later, I think, by the French Thomist Pierre Rousselot in his reflection on how we achieve insight in general. To elucidate the grasp of truth, Rousselot offers the example of a detective solving a crime. The detective, he observes, does not figure out who done it without following clues. That much is obvious. But we tend to overlook the other side. It's not the case that he lays out all the clues first and then deduces a solution. Instead, he's able to determine which of the potentially infinite pieces of evidence are clues only when he sees the solution. He grasps the clues and the solution at the same time. The clues leading to the solution and the solution illuminating the proper steps that lead to it. How these steps fit together and in their unity make the solution evident. So too, coming back to Plato, we can say that the sensibles enable a reasoning to the form only because the form enables them to do so. Again, there's an essential reciprocity here, but it is an asymmetrical one. And the asymmetry is precisely why the embodied vision of truth can be an all-at-once unity. The form as the governing principle has an ontological and, in a sense, also an epistemological priority, even if, and in fact, precisely because, it does not have a temporal priority in the sense that one would first have to grasp the form in one moment, and then the sensibles in their differentiated unity in the moment after. And even if this ontological and epistemological priority remains paradoxical, insofar as it remains, in a certain respect, dependent on the movement from below, which supports and thus enables it, as I will describe now in the next, which will be here, the last section. So in the sentence after the one we've been discussing, Socrates says, "This is recollection." So that whole process I've been describing, that's what Plato presents in the Phaedrus as recollection, making allusion to a notion that appears famously in two other dialogues, the Phaedo and the Meno. The notion here serves to elucidate the all-at-onceness that we've just described, with its absolute priority of form and relative priority of sense experience. While in the allegory of the soul, he associates the all-at-onceness with the experience of beauty, which grips the whole. And that's something, the connection with beauty is something I elaborate in a part that I won't be addressing in this paper here. But let's first attend to the wonderful mystery of recollection itself and see how it illustrates what we've just described in Plato's account of the vision of truth. It's often pointed out that the notion of recollection generally appears in Plato in the context of religious myth concerning the soul's pre-temporal origins, recounted at moments in which Plato suspends his more technical analysis and relies instead on poetic imagery. The inference is sometimes drawn that the notion was never intended seriously and has, if any, only very indirect philosophical significance. But although the account of anamnesis, recollection in the Phaedrus, abounds in poetic imagery, it's interesting that Plato introduces the notion here by identifying it with a non-metaphorical description of the human soul's grasp of truth, as we have just laid out. What he identifies here with recollection is reason's gathering up of the multiplicity of perception into a conceptual unity in reference to a form. So the process we've described. The word anamnesis is in fact quite astonishingly appropriate for the active soul we've been discussing. On the one hand, the form according to which the grasp is achieved cannot be derived from the sense experience in the sense of being founded on that experience and thus arriving, so to speak, after it. As we've seen, a glimpse of the form is presupposed by the sense experience insofar as that experience is able to be gathered up at all. One must already have seen the form if one is to be able to receive the sense data as what it is, namely aesthesis, or perception. This priority of form, this presupposition of form, is given before and in some sense independent of sense experience, is a standard part of Plato's notion of recollection, presented clearly, for example, in the Phaedo. On the other hand, the form is not seen simply prior to the sense experience in such a way as to render the sense experience pointless, or else it would not be recollected. The form would just be known. Plato uses the word memory here, mneme, to describe the soul's direct contact with the forms in 249c, but he describes the gathering of sense experience into the unity of truth as a recollection, a remembering, as caused by something actually at present which occurs to the soul, and at the same time implies a returning to something that has, so to speak, already happened, some precedent event. So the strange mystery of recollection is a coincidence of an already and a not yet. It's no wonder that people have found the notion baffling and have sought to dismiss it, and it's no wonder that Plato tends to be content to leave it shrouded in the mystery of religious myth. Rather than attempt to explain it, we will nevertheless try to take it seriously and show what important claims about the soul's relation to truth that the notion preserves. In a much less mysterious fashion, but perhaps no less baffling, Immanuel Kant famously demonstrated that not only all knowledge, but in fact all sense experience has an a priori element, which provides the conditions of possibility for the experience and knowledge. Plato seems to be recognizing something similar. But while Kant restricts the a priori dimension to the purely formal element of human cognition in what we would call a formalistic sense, so he abstracts from all content, for Plato, the a priori forms are contentful in the sense that all the material content discovered a posteriori is determined to belong to the proper form as its expression or image, rather than being added to the abstracted form and experience. And while for Kant, the a priori forms, categories, and ideas, because they cannot be found in experience by definition, must be understood as built into the structure of the knowing apparatus, so to speak. For Plato, and I really want to stress this point here, for Plato, the forms are in fact, in some sense, discovered as inexperience, as belonging to the objects that are known. And in fact, they're loved thereby. They're both known and loved as belonging to an object. So this presents a fascinating question for the interpretation of Platonic recollection. Are the forms that are recollected always already in the soul, as proto-Kantian a priori structures of the mind? Or does the soul have to discover them in some sense outside of itself? There can be no doubt that the forms lie in the soul. The principal thrust of the notion of recollection is that one already knows the forms, contrary to one's initial ignorance of this fact. So in the Meno, as we all know, it's a slave boy who has not previously received any instruction in mathematics who recognizes the truth of the proof Socrates presents. When it comes to the deepest truths, the teacher in Plato does not introduce something new, but like a midwife brings to birth the understanding that is already there. This is a consistent point in Plato. Okay. But I want to suggest this is only half of the point. If the forms were already present in the soul simply without further qualification, there would be no apparent reason to speak of recollection, which implies at the very least some intervening forgetting rather than straightforward knowledge. If Plato insists on the presence of the forms in the soul, he is no less insistent on an absence of some sort, the need to overcome some sort of distance. The forms, even if they're present somehow in the soul, are not immediately accessible. They do not simply unfold from the soul in a natural, organic way, but their discovery invariably involves some form of discontinuity with the soul's normal condition. To use Aristotle's language, recollection is not simply a passing from first actuality of having knowledge stored in the soul in a potential state to the second actuality of its being brought forth directly to the mind. Instead, the notion implies a more significant happening to the soul, as it were. If this discontinuity tends to be intimated by a kind of uncanny tone when Plato discusses recollection, it stands forth thematically in the Phaedrus as one of the principal points of emphasis. As we've seen, Plato stresses the ecstatic dimension in the dialogue. The physical journey goes beyond the walls. The allegory of the soul foregrounds nothing so much as the transcendence of truth. It's placed beyond the walls of the cosmos, beyond even the gods, in the supra-heavenly sphere. Far from delving into its own immanent depths, the soul has to travel out beyond its own limits in order to come to a vision of truth. It has to be displaced to stand out from all human matters. Thus, the forms are already present in the soul, but in order to see them, the soul has to transcend itself. So what are we to make of this strange paradox? In an excellent study of recollection in Plato, Francisco Gonzalez surveys the major currents of interpretation on this question and reveals the inadequacy in each case. Recollection implies neither an initial absence of knowledge in the soul nor an initial presence. So this is the paradox that we were discussing. He, Gonzalez, thus proposes his own solution, which is that knowledge is present in the soul, specifically in the form of desire, which Gonzalez elaborates according to the account given in the Symposium. Eros, as the child of Poros and Pania, fullness and lack, implies a simultaneity of possession and non-possession. Gonzalez's solution is indeed quite evidently better than all the others he considers, but we have to see that it is not so much an explanation as it is a restatement of the very same paradox in a new register. Both Eros and recollection imply the simultaneity of presence and absence of the reality in question. If either aspect is denied, we run into an insoluble problem. When Plato describes recollection in the Meno, he says that the soul, quote, learns and seeks what it knows. Again, highlighting that the presence of learning or having learned does not exclude, but precisely coincides with, the absence implied in seeking. One might quibble that Gonzalez himself, by saying that knowledge is present in the soul only in the form of desire, overemphasizes the seeking and eclipses the actual learning. We recall that in the Phaedrus, the place of truth is presented as a resting place. Even if, in the allegory, Plato does not allow even the gods to come to a definitive standstill in this place, much less the burdened human soul, truth is nevertheless presented as a place of enjoyment, completion, and festivity. The souls are not simply on a perpetual journey, constantly on the move, without an orienting aim. If the souls are on the move, it is always in reference to a home, an end, to and from which they proceed. Again, both aspects need to be retained. One might be tempted to read Plato in what amounts to a Gnostic fashion, in which the soul has a kind of divine element, a spark buried inside it, so to speak. And so what is presented as a journey is just an uncovering of the soul's own inward depths. This, though, I think would be the danger of the reading that would reduce the question of the quest for knowledge to a quest for self-knowledge, as Griswold, for instance, I think falls into that problem, which makes a deepening of one's knowledge of oneself and indeed of the soul in general an essential and integral part of knowledge simply. But it remains the case that knowledge is also an encounter with something other, something that transcends the soul. Knowledge of self coincides with knowledge of the other. This is a point Plato makes repeatedly in the drama. And this coincidence occurs in the place of truth. Rather than attempt to explain the paradox, which would invariably become an explaining away, Plato wisely insists on retaining both sides, however much tension there appears to be between them, and preserves the simultaneity in the form of a myth. But while respecting this mystery, one may nevertheless venture to state it more plainly and indeed in more directly philosophical terms. Returning to the account of the human soul in the grasp of truth, which Plato says is recollection, we may observe that it is the nature of unity to be transcendent. In other words, as Aristotle too comes to recognize, the unity of a whole cannot simply be constructed from its parts or somehow derived from them. It has to be taken as given, which means as already there. To learn the truth of a thing means that one receives or recognizes the principle of unity, which grounds the knowledge as already prior, and so is preceding one's recognition, which is just what makes it a recognition. It's significant in this case that in this context that the tense of the verb Plato uses to express recollection is not the past tense, which would indicate a particular event that occurred at an earlier time, or the imperfect tense, which would indicate repetition or habit. It is the perfect tense, indicating a condition that is complete with respect to the present moment. It thus serves to describe what the act of knowing actually is. To put it another way, more metaphorically here, one can indeed discover the truth of a thing, and in this respect learn it, so discover the truth of a thing, which means receive it as something new, but only in the form of already having been there. So this is the paradox I'm trying to, you encounter something, but what you encounter, what you see precisely in the form of its already having been there. The principle arrives, so to speak, but not as an object merely external to the soul. It enters the soul, but it does so not materially from without, but immaterially, which inevitably means both and inseparably from without and from within. So it's the very nature, as you see, the point is, it's the very nature of a form which is not material to become present only as always having been there, as eternal. What the Phaedrus makes clearer than the other dialogues that discuss recollection is that the forms can enter into the soul only if the soul itself enters into the place of the form. So this is why he's the whole setting of the walls going outside the city. The soul has knowledge when it conforms to the reality it knows, and the reality it knows are the forms that lie outside both time and place. There's an extraordinary reciprocity here. It's only when the soul comes out of itself in an ecstatic condition that the forms reveal themselves as being within the soul. More succinctly, the forms are in the soul when the soul is out of itself. Such a coincidence, to say it again, requires a distinctive sort of place in which to occur. If Plato presents recollection as a discrete achievement, that occurs in one moment or another, 248a, when the soul catches sight of the forms by lifting up its head above the heavens. Such an achievement can occur because of a decisive shift of perspective. Plato thus describes recollection in the Phaedrus as a condition, the burgeoning of wings, or state of mind, so to speak, in which the soul persists as long as it is able. 249c. The language of initiation, again, is crucial here. It indicates not so much a temporal beginning. The Greek word for initiation, telete, unlike the English, speaks of the end rather than the beginning. The Greek word means an entry into a state of perfection, an entry into something that has always already been complete, which is in principle definitive. He says. It is the one who has entered this state that is alone truly perfect. So here we see end and beginning coincide. The one who has reached the place of truth in the transcendence of reason, both the subjective and objective genitive is meant here, is always thus being initiated and finds a final rest in what remains an always new beginning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for this fascinating meditation on Phaedrus. And yeah, I will take the opportunity to start off the discussion. I really like the idea of this dramatic reading of Plato, with a sort of sensitivity to images and sort of metaphors, but also stories and the theatrical or dramatic quality, because there is this sense in which Plato is bypassing discursive reason often by using that. So I just I will just say a few impressions really that I had while listening to you. First of all, I had this thought that uh, one of the best commentaries on Phaedrus is Dante's Divine Comedy, or rather Paradiso. Although, as we know, the Latin Middle Ages didn't have access to Phaedrus, but they had access to other Latin texts, of course, in the sense that what you show, the spatial imagery and spatial symbolism, I think is crucial here. And I must say that the more I'm thinking about the allegory of the cave, what strikes me is this movement out of something very narrow. This is basic, maybe this is obvious, but you know, we have been told so many times that, you know, the vision of the forms is some abstract intellectual experience, like it is going into your head
Yeah.
from the outside world,
Yeah.
that it's easy to miss the point that Plato's makes, that it's actually going out to the open. It's, you know, it's the feeling of breaking out of a prison. This is clearly the essence of this image. And here in Phaedrus, I think we have a similar movement. So you said that at the beginning there is this going out of the walls, and that's interesting. We can discuss that later, because I mean the we have to take into account the way the ancient Greeks, they experienced the city and nature outside of the city, but this going out and out and out, and this the sense of expansion that is here clear. And because this hyper Uranius topos, which is outside of heavens, is at the same time encompassing, because if something is outside,
Yeah.
it's holding something inside. It's containing.
Yeah.
And
Nice.
I'm really interested in what you think about this metaphor of nurturing and growth, because actually I was inspired by Plotinus mostly, and Augustine, because Plotinus, commenting on this passage, he says that truth is mother and nurse. And really in Phaedrus, a couple of times Plato says that the souls are fed they're nourished. And so there is this maternal quality to truth and the place of truth. And it seems like this maternal quality is very prominent here, in the sense that if you I was imagining a child playing at home, and so the mother is there, but the mother's presence doesn't have to
Hmm.
be palpable, or she doesn't impose her presence on the child, but in a way the child is moving inside this maternal presence of care and love. And sometimes the child comes to the mother and is given some food and nourished, but it's also allowed to move and roam freely. So this is just an image that I had while revisiting this passage. And I'm really curious what you think about this, and the relationship between the how Plato sees space and these spatial images, and this strangely maternal, sensible uh, quality of the image of feeding a pasture and all of that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, that's nice. Thank you. That's a sort of a traditional um, um, association of space and with womb, with the mother. So I mean, certainly there that note is being struck here. But I find that it's interesting. I find a sort of complementary. If again, one doesn't want to push these too far, but if there's an association with the masculine or the father who sort of pushes out, um, sets off alone, that note is here too. This it seems to me, going out beyond, um, being, this Socrates mentions how unfamiliar this is, how much this is sort of moving out of the home, moving out. Um, there's a paradox there, but I think one always needs to hold on to both sides of it. There's something affirming and nurturing and holding together, but then there's also this, moving out beyond and disturbing what seems to be already given. There's novelty, and it's the simultaneity of novelty and familiarity. I think is what stands out to me in reading the Phaedrus. That connects with the other basic point that uh, the more I think about, the more fundamental it seems, and that is, I've sort of laid it out in the presentation, but I'll just repeat it here, make it explicit. We often think of what recollection. One criticism of recollection, this is from somebody like Kierkegaard, for instance, who wants to juxtapose repetition to recollection, because he finds recollection, it's always repeating what was already there rather than encountering what is new. So the criticism, or the concern, is that recollection is always a sort of, just an unfolding what's given. I find it so fascinating how much emphasis is given, therefore, in this dialogue, to the fact that they're going out beyond the walls. I mean, it seems to me that's not accidental. At least there's highlighting of this idea that what recollection means isn't simply returning to what's already there, but in fact has something more like this, uh, act of transcendence, this movement out beyond, as its fundamental shape. So that's, I think, is something that's not, that needs to be registered here, and that's clearly what's being emphasized in the Phaedrus. Now, what makes that possible? And this is something that I've been thinking about. I've been reading some, Max Shaler with a student here, and his, description of the non-formal a priori, in contrast to Kant, seems to be very similar to what Plato has in mind here. We tend to think, that it either has to already be there, or it has to be something, the either or. It has to come from without or come from within. And it seems to me that's almost inevitably because we are reifying, materializing the forms in some sense. We can only think of these in physical terms ultimately, and it becomes very different if you become aware of that and remove that. If it's no longer, if it really is not physical, then um, there's no dichotomy between novelty and familiarity, between transcendence and immanence. So it can be the case that you learn something for the first time precisely as something you've always already known,
Yeah.
something you've eternally known. You learn it for the first time as something that's always been in your mind, and somehow both of those is true. Though both of those statements are true.
There is, you're right, and also I'm correcting my impression, because you emphasize this paternal aspect of exploration, going to the unknown, and I'm just thinking, that Socrates and Phaedrus, they are discussing uh, Boreas and the rape
Mm-hmm.
of this young virgin by the god of the northern wind. So there is a sense
Right,
of rapture
right,
in the literal sense of this violent movement that takes someone, in this case, this young virgin, out of her family and to the divine realm. And so there is, and of course, to go out of the city for the Greeks would be to go into nature, which is dangerous,
mm-hmm.
which is unpredictable. But the way that Plato describes the place, the setting of the scene, is very conventional. It alludes to Greek lyrical poetry as this locus amenus, this beautiful place when you talk about love. So there is this sense, as you say, I'm discovering it right now, that there is a sense of familiarity and the unfamiliar at the same time. So that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, but probably other people will also have some questions or comments. So please, you can unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment.
Please, Matthew, Nina.
Matthew.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, thank you, Professor Schindler, for a really lucid paper that I enjoyed very much. Uh, I'd like to talk about the beginning and the ending of your paper and this idea of ecstasis, which I found really, really interesting. Of course, you start with Heidegger, and he's sort of this frame, and then this ecstasis comes up. And of course, readers of Heidegger know that this is an idea that comes up in Being and Time, with the idea of time, of the three ecstasies of time, of the past, the present, and the future. And here in your interpretation of the Phaedrus, we have this sort of similar movement coming up in terms of topos, of space. I found that incredibly interesting. Um, I'm just wondering how this idea of ecstasy ties into the whole paradox of knowledge that you're bringing out. And full disclosure about the background of my question, I'm working on a book on Schelling right now, and you have ecstasy in Schelling in a very similar way that you do in Heidegger, this idea of knowledge is this Tomatsein, this moment of wonder that's completely ineffable. Then you have discursive knowledge, then you have this sort of theoria moment of going back into an ignorance that's a knowing that has known. And so I found incredibly helpful this idea of the paradox of the old and the new, of recollection as a form or a way of knowing that is really acquiring kind of new knowledge. So, how do you see this idea of ecstasy as sort of overcoming kind of the basic sort of accusation we could make against anamnesis, which is, oh, well, it's recollection, so it's repetition, there's nothing new. So
Yeah.
maybe you could talk more about that.
Yeah. No, thank you. The reference to Heidegger is helpful. As you mentioned, in Being in Time, he has the three ecstasies in relation to the temporal ecstasies, and the temporal ecstasies that in a way constitute um, the time itself. What's interesting, and I think one way to think about what I'm suggesting with respect to Plato here, is there's a radical difference One thing that you don't get in Heidegger is a proper notion of eternity. He's very critical of a sense of eternity, which he sees as the nunc stans. And this is an eternal now. It's sort of like one moment that never that never ends. The problem is that's a temporal reduction of the meaning of eternity. Because it's making it all a single temporal moment in a way. Obviously one qualifies that. What I find really distinctive, and here's the thing: a sign that somebody is temporalizing eternity is when they think that if something is eternal, it means it already was. You see, or that it extends forever in the future, something like that. That's when people talk about whether, for example, here's an instance, and I think that this gets into some of the paradox here. One of the ways that the question comes up is in this question of divine foreknowledge. If God is eternal, that means he already has always known what I'm going to do in the future. You see, but the problem is that's actually not you've temporalized what eternity means, and you mean when you say eternity, you mean always before time, which is temporalizing it. It's this sort of mysterious thing before time. But if you think of it, if you shift, it's not a moment before, but it genuinely transcends the whole distinction between past, present, and future. It transcends all three of those. Genuinely, it means that there's no contradiction in saying that God doesn't know what I'm going to do until I do it. But his knowledge of that is something he has known from all eternity, you see. And that seems strange, but that it seems to me that unless we see those kinds of paradoxes, we're actually in subtle ways reducing the scope of what the eternal means. And what I'm suggesting is, for Plato, an insight into the forms is genuinely the soul's contact with something that really does transcend time, and therefore transcend the distinction between past, present, and future. And that's why it can be, in some sense, genuinely novel and always having been there in another respect at the same time. The dichotomy, the either or, only falls to something that is within the limits of time. But if it's outside of the limits of time, then that you don't have to choose between those. And I think that this perspective is very clearly missing in Heidegger. I think that one of the reasons he rejects so much of the classical tradition is that he sees it as having privileged a kind of nunc stans view that then diminishes the meaning of the finite and so forth. We could get into Heidegger. Schelling might fall off the horse in the other direction, but that's a whole other thing. I've given a long enough answer. I'll just stop there.
I just remembered Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, and Matthew is a fan of Mann as well. So when he describes how nunc stans is the experience of walking along the sea when you walk the beach, and but in light of your interpretation, it's a wrong image that Mann gives here, because there is a sense of this almost like in Meister Eckhart, the desert of the divine. So you're walking alongside the sea, nothing is happening, nothing new is happening. So Mann says you can have the experience of nunc stans, but what you emphasize is the newness, the freshness of eternity, which would bring to mind Saint Augustine and his the prayer from Book 10, Sero te amavi pulchritudo tam antiqua et tam nova. So late have I loved you, beauty so old and so new. So the two are one. here.
And isn't it interesting? So he connects it with beauty there, which is just what Plato was doing in the Phaedrus. And you know, I really do think that one of the many great achievements, I mean, epic making achievements of Plato is precisely this discovery of supratemporal being. I don't know that anyone saw it before him. And even after him, there's a tendency to lose the sense of it and reduce things to a kind of a materialist interpretation. I think Plotinus does not do that. I mean, I think he's got as radical a sense of that as anybody. But I think it's really a crucial thing to see, and it's in Plato, and a proper appreciation of Plato's philosophy is to reckon with this point. Failing to do so is one of the reasons why we have so many caricatures of Plato's notion of the forms. You know, we tend to think of these as big things floating out in space, kind of for all time, and that's not that both temporalizes and physicalizes them. I mean, we're talking about something really radically different. And when you see the radical difference, it becomes far more reasonable. It's not a facile caricature.
Other questions or comments?
Yes.
No, Jakub.
First of all, thank you for your lecture. And before the lecture, I actually grabbed your book, Plato's Critique of Empiricism, to see what was important for me in this book. And I was amazed to realize that every other page is marked. So it's quite amazing. But I remember there's one passage in this book, and it's stuck in my mind. Somewhere in Plato's Critique of Empiricism, you said that it was actually, I think it's relevant to our discussion today, that it's doubtful in view of Plato's philosophy whether he believed in actuality of reincarnation, metempsychosis.
Right. Yeah.
So in the light of today's discussion, I'm curious on your perspective on this idea, whether we treat it literally or whether we should perhaps reinterpret it and see it perhaps as a metaphor.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you. That's exactly right. I mean, if you think about what is reincarnation except a temporalization of eternity? You know, so the idea that for Plato, the reason that we have that the phenomenon of recollection is that our souls existed in some time before this one, so that when we have an experience this time, we say, "Oh yeah, no, that was in a previous life." You know, I mean, the thing about that, and he uses that metaphor in many cases. He sort of spells that out. That's Phaedrus is one of the clearest instance, but not the only one. I mean, it seems to me that the problem with that interpretation is pretty obvious. You know, what's the problem with saying that the reason that knowledge is recollection is that we're recovering an experience we had of knowing in the past? Well, the problem with that is that when we had that experience in the past, was it also an experience of recollection? And you get this infinite regress problem. At some point, you would have to have encountered it, simply received it through sense experience, and that's contrary to his whole philosophy. So that becomes a kind of a very kind of idiotic, really, interpretation of what's going on here. This idea that you can somehow account for transcendence through simple repetition infinitely in the past just makes no sense at all. So clearly, the only possible sense it can have is reference to something that genuinely transcends time. Now you might ask, well, why does he present it in this form? I mean, there's a lot that's illuminating about it. Once you see that, his notion of returning in a way that corresponds to the content of the choices that one makes. So if you choose sensible pleasures, then you're reincarnated as an animal and so forth. I mean, it seems to me that's a way of saying that to choose sensible pleasures as a governing principle is to be an animal. Now, you see, it's a way of describing actually kind of uh, the actual character of a person now. So it doesn't, it doesn't require that kind of mythological story to be illuminative, if that makes sense.
All right, thank you. This is very illuminating. And now when you talked, I realized there's this passage in Phaedrus where Socrates pays attention to cicadas and they're singing.
Yeah.
And I think in the light of this idea of this shift, of this reconfiguration, because at the point that cicadas are introduced, if I remember correctly, they become an inspiration, somewhat a window to the divine. They inspire Socrates for further reflection. So it's a curious idea that this, perhaps the lowest form of life in the Platonic hierarchy, becomes this window to the perhaps transcendent.
Yeah. Oh, that's very nice. I hadn't made that particular connection, but that does that is really interesting. And you see, I mean, that's why it's by affirming both the lowest and the highest. I mean, that's what beauty. That's one of the things that beauty is really significant here is that it captures the whole dimension of the experience. So it's not simply intellectual insight, and nor is it simply sensible experience. It's somehow we have a sensible experience of what transcends sense experience in this one instance of beauty. The thing about beauty, it's so extraordinary, is that it appeals to every dimension of our being and not just one or the other, as these other things do. So it touches the highest and the lowest at the same time, you might say. Um, the other thing that's interesting that's part two of this paper. I actually get into that a bit more about with the cicadas is there's a kind of an ambiguity. They both represent the beauty of coming to a rest, but they also present the danger of coming to a rest simply, and perishing for lack of nourishment to touch that again. So I think there's a really rich ambiguity in the very image of the cicadas that's nice. So again, the point that we're aiming at finally is simultaneous rest and motion.
But it's also connected with poetry. And interestingly, if you try to read Phaedrus against the Republic, there is this interesting I mean, there is this value that Plato gives to poetry in Phaedrus, and I'm really thinking about this moment when he says that, the place above the heaven, the hyper Uranius topos, no poet has ever
Right.
sung, but now I have to do it. And
Yeah.
this is of course very conventional in ancient literature, the sense of emulation, the rivalry with the previous poets. But Plato, of course, can be very critical about poets and poetry and this kind of stuff. But here he is inspired himself. He's in the state of mania. He says, it's impossible to express this, but I have to, it has to be done. So here we go. And I find it very interesting. So
Yeah. No, thank you. What's really important to see there, a couple of things to say about that. First of all, there's some people who have a developmental view of Plato's philosophy and read the Phaedrus as a later dialogue, and he's actually changed his view. So Martha Nussbaum, for instance, very famously talks about Plato having changed his view. He was initially against beauty and sensible pleasures, but then he realized that that's one-sided, and so. But I think that's just a superficial reading of Plato. I think one can see the harmony of these different perspectives. They're aspects of a single mystery. And sometimes he emphasizes more the distance between things. Sometimes he emphasizes more the unity, but that's not the sign of his being uncertain or changing his position on things. I think in the Republic, though he's critical of poets, I mean, he's also in a way he's telling the great drama of Socrates. I mean, it is a poetic work. It's very clearly he's writing a work that's critical of writing. I mean, I think that is quite self-conscious, and that there's not. I've argued that's not contradictory. Now, you mentioned the mania here and this inspiration. It seems to me that that's another helpful way into the paradox he's got in mind here. On the one hand, you might think of if you're inspired, you're moved by something without really understanding it, and so there's a kind of irrational, something irrational about that, and you would then contrast that to pure rationality that without any you're totally uninspired, but you're able to lay out one proposition after another in a chain of reasoning. And it seems to me that Plato wants to say that both of those are one-sided and inadequate. And he's not simply championing, inspiration above reason or reason above inspiration, but that he's arguing that you can actually only have either one in a genuine sense when they're simultaneous with each other. Reason is only properly rational when it's inspired, and one can only speak rationally about something when one has been brought to relate to a principle that transcends reason itself. And that's what this shifting that I've been talking about, this ecstasis, is where reason is now, rather than taking its bearings from the sub-rational passions, as in the first speech, it's now taking its bearings from supra-rational transcendence, the forms. And it's only now that it can actually be properly rational for the first time. So there's a simultaneity of being out of one's mind and perfectly rational at the same time, you see. Because you're now connecting your reasoning to something greater than yourself.
Anyone else?
And that's why the poetry and the philosophy then come together. It's poetic philosophy, or however you'd like to put it. I don't know if anybody has a comment. Yeah.
Kuba, again.
Just thought about this idea that this dialogue takes place at high noon, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting because you said that there's this paradox of motion and rest, and actually at high noon the sun appears to be still, but it moves and it deceives our senses. And of course it relates to the idea of the good, I think, as well, because the whole dialogue in a sense takes place under auspices of the good. I know.
Yeah. Of course.
Yeah. So just a comment. Yeah.
No, it's once you see that the theme of paradox, you see it just running all through the dialogue. It's really quite astonishing. The motion and rest, eternity and time, reason and love and passion and so forth. All, poetry and philosophy, they're all, and the whole point in a way is bringing the highest and the lowest together. The whole point of the dialogue, so that you have a properly embodied whole. So we haven't talked at all about the second half of the Phaedrus, which is the discussion of rhetoric and writing and how that factors. But I think one can bring that in when you realize that the integrating point in the end is not simply beauty as an experience, but beauty as the manifestation of truth. That then the analytic discussion is not extraneous to it, but actually part of properly having the full experience of beauty. So those things typically get juxtaposed to each other. But I think this is, one of the big hermeneutical questions in reading the Phaedrus is how these different parts fit together, because they seem so discontinuous.
The point you make about this marriage of reason with this supra-rational or trans-rational dimension, I mean, it can be found in so many, I mean, so diverse figures, like later, of course, like Blaise Pascal, of course, with his concept of the heart, and the geometrical analytical reason has to be grounded in the heart, and then Simone Weil in the French tradition, but also you can find it in G.K. Chesterton, and his idea that if reason is left alone, this is madness, and sanity is reason connected to this wider world and perspective. So, and I think somehow we can trace it back to Plato, to this perpetual hermeneutic problem, in that the philosopher who seems to be so critical of myth and poetry and images is speaking in such powerful poetic images. What are we to do with this? So I think your proposal that we see that this holistically as an attempt to integrate all of these things. I mean, you can even say that Ian McGilchrist, who is very Heideggerian in his criticism of Plato. I mean, he's talking about the same thing in his view of the left and right hemisphere, the master and the emissary, the integration of reason with this sort of deeper wisdom, which is non-discursive.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I think it's often the case that maybe one of it's almost like a litmus test. That might be putting it too facilely, but it seems to me that a sign of a deep thinker is precisely a seeing of the unity of these dimensions, and that it's always going to be when you've kind of reduced things to a lesser level where you start to see these various dimensions as opposed. So, I mean, even just in interpretations of Plato, sometimes you'll have people talk about whether whether he affirms propositional knowledge or non-propositional knowledge, and the point is, the answer is yes. And if you think that the only way to affirm non-propositional, like the transcendence of the proposition, is that somehow to get rid of the significance of propositions, you've lost the battle. It's always both together. It's never, the point is, for Plato, it's never merely propositional nor merely non-propositional. It's always a criticism of the inadequacy of a one-sidedness. And I think this is something that one sees in the greatest of figures. Hegel is like that too, always wanting to see the unity that holds things together. I mean, this is also Schelling's constant theme that you can't really have difference unless there's a unity there behind it. I think when you see that, you realize that that the philosophical tradition isn't just like one individual coming after another, and they happen to say some things that are similar and some things that are different. There really is a kind of a shared tradition that these different thinkers are helping to receive fully, and cooperating, I think, more fundamentally than we often sort of give credit for. And that's why even a proper scholarship is not just about learning the history of thought, but learning thought through the history, and trying to recover a sense of this unity that's holding these different thinkers together.
I'm also thinking about something which is connected to Jakob's question about reincarnation, also your point about time, and the issue that Matthew brought in, namely that there is a difference, I think, between Plato and later tradition, especially the Christian tradition, in the way that the past and the future are perceived. So, for instance, in ancient Greek, the past is in front of us and the future is behind us.
Yeah,
In
yeah,
Greek, opistan means, which is literally behind me. It means afterwards. And I'm sometimes I'm trying to sort of feel into this way of, because for me, and I think for us, naturally, future is ahead of us. We are moving towards the future and we are leaving the past behind. This is the whole idea of progress and evolution, which is a Jewish and Christian idea, I think. But for the ancient Greeks, I think the past what was in front of them.
right.
So the idea of recollection, and which for us may be, repetitive, or maybe there's nothing new there. I think for them, the past was so rich, and it's there was something
Yeah.
different in the way they were feeling that, I think. I don't know if you.
Yeah, no, I mean, there'd be a lot to say about that. I mean, even just thinking about this, we can't help but import our own sort of habitual categories. So we think of the past as, the time that comes before. But it's very different if you think in vertical rather than sort of horizontal terms. You get a very different sense of the shape of things, and so it becomes intelligible to think about time as catching up to the past. If the past is the revelation of what always is in some sense, then we can really genuinely think of ourselves as catching up to it. So in that sense, that would be a way of thinking about the past as in front of us and not simply behind us that we're moving away from. But uh, and I think it's important to see um, that typically we will contrast the ancient Greeks with their cyclical sense, saying that they have no sense of history. We contrast that with modernity, or sorry, with we'll talk about a Judeo-Christian notion that has a sense of progress. It's actually more complex than that. I think we need to make a threefold distinction. Progress, this notion of progress, endless progress into the future, that's not Christian, that's modern. And there's a difference between, I think, the strictly modern sense of mere progress with the Christian sense, which really is an integration of history and eternity. So the Judeo-Christian dimension doesn't simply bring a contrast to the ancient Greek. It actually affirms the ancient Greek in a more expanded way that includes the novelty of history. But it's in modernity. Hannah Arendt is very good on this, that we have the sense of history being, as they say, just one damn thing after another, this constant sort of meaningless movement, always into the future without any real connection to what went before. I think that's not Christian. That's modern.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, indeed. Coming back again to the tam antiqua and tam nova, so the God is the ultimate past and the newness
Yeah,
and the freshness and the future. So the alpha and the omega, it
yeah,
transcends. You're right. It transcends those fragmentary perspectives.
yeah, 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 yeah. No, I find it. You find that I was just reading in a French historian that made that contrast between the ancient, no sense of history, and then the Christian view of history as progress rather than being cyclical. And that's, the Christian view is both. It's both progress and cyclical. It's got both. It's an integration of time and eternity. Um, uh, Pure time without eternity is a very different kind of thing.
And as you said, there is this dynamic unity between eternity and time. So they are not to be opposed in the sense that eternity is standing still when time is still moving. It is always moving, but time is the moving image of eternity for Plato, which establishes a relationship between the archetype and its expression and its appearance or image, which is, so they are not divorced, of course, from each other.
And not to open up a whole new bag of worms, as they say, but just to, I one thing I would love to study more in the future, no pun intended, is this Neoplatonic sense of the one as transcending even eternity. That I think is a crucially important thing that gets overlooked. That we can integrate time and eternity only because there's a transcendence even of eternity. But that's something you find in Plotinus and certain Neoplatonic thinkers, and even Aquinas mentions it, but it's you almost never hear reference to it in discussion. And I think it's I think it needs to come back. But I it's something I'd like to study in the future.
I mean, for example, in terms of what you were talking about today, Plotinus is he's wondering in amazement at the concept of the advent of the one. So the one reveals itself or breaks into our experience. But Plotinus says, but it cannot come because it's already there. So and then he builds up a paradox upon a paradox. In what sense something which is already there can be absent, or how can it come to us? And Augustine is repeating this in the very first chapters of the Confessions. So he invokes God, but he says, how can I ask you to come if you are already there? And so there is a certain transcendence even of that. And so that's okay. Thank you very much once more for this wonderful talk, and thanks to all of you for listening to it and engaging in a discussion.
I've appreciated the opportunity. Thanks for having me. I thank you for the questions that came up, and I wish you all well.
Okay. Thank you, David, once more. And see you all. I will be sending information about the next lectures. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night.